Hello, and welcome back to Plantopia. Plantopia is the plant health podcast of the American Phytopathological Society, and I'm your host, Matt Kasson. I'm an associate professor of forest pathology and mycology at West Virginia University. This is the 9th episode of Season 4 of Plantopia, and today we're talking with Dr. Elena Karlsen-Ayala, a research plant pathologist with the USDA Forest Service, Northern Research Station in Hamden, Connecticut. Dr. Karlsen-Ayala completed her BA at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts in 2016, where she double majored in biological sciences and Africana studies. She completed her PhD at the University of Florida under Dr. Romina Gazis and Dr. Matt Smith, studying ectomycorrhizal fungal communities of Florida slash pine in southern Florida. She completed a postdoc with Sarah Strauss, studying soil health, soil resiliency in a post-fumigation world. She began her current position with the USDA Forest Service in September of 2023. Dr. Karlsen-Ayala has co-instructed courses in bioinformatics for soil microbial ecology, graduate plant pathology, and fungus among us. She is active with APS, currently serving as Vice President for the Forest Pathology Committee. This is our special Halloween episode, so she may not know it yet, but we're going to discuss zombie trees and ghost forests, among other seasonally appropriate topics. So stay tuned. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have another forest pathologist and someone who thinks a lot about trees on the podcast for our listeners.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I just wanted to say before we got started that I think a lot of times as researchers, we're really focused on like our research output in terms of like publications and grants. And I've tuned into a couple episodes and I really like that this podcast is a little bit more holistic and focuses on the career path and provides some time to really reflect on the experiences and people that were instrumental in getting us here. So just wanted to say thanks for providing that outlet.
Absolutely. I think if we only reported H-index values in this podcast, people would fall asleep listening to it. And if they're listening to it in their car, that's probably not like a safe combination. I see you started out at Smith College studying biological sciences and Africana studies, where you completed your BA in 2016. Are you from that area, from Massachusetts or from New England?
So I'm from Connecticut originally. So I've actually come back home after about 10 years of being away. So yeah, from a New England native. I
ask this of all our guests because a lot of people want to know your origin story. You're working for the Forest Service now as a research plant pathologist. What kind of experiences did you have with agriculture or forestry in your early life that may have shaped who you became?
I think I've always been a very inquisitive person. I feel as a child, I was always the kid that's like, why this, why that, why this, why that? So I think I was primed to be a scientist. And I always really loved the outdoors, going hiking. And I think it wasn't really until college where I saw that you could have jobs that could blend all of those interests. I think it's easy to focus on kind of the big careers, doctor, lawyer. And so it wasn't really until I started at Smith and took a lot of classes that had field components that I was like, oh, this is really cool. I can work outside and I can blend my inquisitive nature with my love for the outdoors. So I think it was always primed in my background, but I think my experiences at Smith really solidified that.
What part of Connecticut did you grow up in?
I grew up in southern Connecticut, so actually very close to where I am now. So I came home.
And for people listening that aren't familiar with that part of the state, what part of the state is that?
It's the central part of the state, right in the south along the shoreline. So we're about 5 or 10 minutes from the ocean. But Yale University is probably where most people might be familiar. We're about an hour and a half from New York City by train, 2 hours from Boston.
Mm-hmm. Smith is a very well-regarded women's college, but with very few student enrollments, less than 3,000 total students. What was the experience like at Smith?
Yeah, I really wanted to go to a small liberal arts college. UConn, which would have been the state school I went to, has got probably about 40 or 50,000 students, and that felt really daunting to me as a 17-year-old applying to schools. I really liked women's colleges. I just liked the feel of that environment, and I liked the small liberal arts schools because you weren't competing with grad students. So I knew I would get a lot of undergraduate research experiences that I may have gotten at a larger institution, but I knew would have been guaranteed at a smaller school. And the thing that really drew me to Smith was that it's located in the valley of Western Massachusetts with 4 other colleges in the valley. So UMass, Amherst College, Mount Holyoke, which is another women's college, and Hampshire College. And so we could take classes at any of those 5 colleges. And so I felt if I want the big state school experience, I could go over to UMass.
I have heard of Smith College. Obviously, Sylvia Plath went there and Julia Child, and there's some, former first ladies that went there. They take their role as educators very seriously at that institution. Tell us a little bit more about your honors thesis and what got you into that. How did that come about? And maybe tell the listeners here what you looked at.
Yeah, so my honors thesis was about this idea of assisted migration. So that has gained a lot more attention lately, of this idea of moving organisms outside of their native range to keep up with climate change, and the fact that climate change may push species outside of their native range. And the project was really interested in, okay, if you take species outside of their native range, but species that are obligately reliant on mutualists, are they going to be able to find and establish mutualisms in these other areas? And so the honors thesis was a mesocosm experiment where we took soil from the southern Appalachian Mountains and soil from the Massachusetts area, and we did a reciprocal transplant where we planted Rhododendron catabiense, which is endemic to the southern Appalachian Mountains, and Rhododendron maximum, which is native to New England. We did a reciprocal transplant experiment to see if they could establish these mutualisms. And I fell into the undergrad thesis in a kind of odd way, in that I was working in the lab of the professor who was advising the thesis, and I was helping with the lab work and the field work for this experiment. But it was actually not my honors thesis initially. There was another student who was working on this project, and I was assisting her. And I can't remember the specifics. I think for some reason she couldn't finish the thesis. She ended up dropping out of that program. And so I ended up taking over the thesis. And so it was a really unique opportunity for me to get that experience to write up and analyze all those data that I was already working on.
And of course, you were geographically in the right place, because I looked up the range in iNaturalist for Catawba rhododendron, and really northern Massachusetts, with the exception of a few data points in down east Maine and coastal Maine region, it basically stops right at northern Massachusetts. So that's a real good opportunity to ask those questions about how the geographic range of plants shift and how that happens, and if there are barriers for that happening, whether it be a patchy distribution of plants or other factors like soil microbiome.
Yeah, exactly. And it's come full circle, because that initial thesis did not have a whole kind of sequencing component and identifying the fungi. It was beyond the scope of the work and kind of the scope of the lab research. And I've gone off and learned all these high-tech molecular skills and have returned to the area. And that professor has reached out to see if we want to continue the work and collaborate with some future undergrad students who've taken that initial work and ran with it. So it feels very full circle to be returning to some of those questions.
Another reason I was excited to have you on is when I look at your research experience, your publications, I see a really well-rounded fungal ecology. And it makes sense that you're working for the Forest Service because you're asking big, like, fungal ecology questions. I think a lot of plant pathologists don't get that mutualism side of things sometimes. We spent a lot of time talking about the other end of the symbiosis spectrum, that is parasitism. And mycorrhizal fungi are so important, especially if we're thinking about building resilience into our landscapes. But I feel we teach the general basics about ecto and endomycorrhizal fungi. People can spot off terms like arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And they can talk about different boletes and different Amanita species, these ectomycorrhizal. But ericoid mycorrhizal fungi aren't as well known. Do you want to remind the listeners what we mean when we say, like, ericoid mycorrhizal fungi?
Yeah, I always joke they're the underappreciated fungi. So Ericoid mycorrhizae associate specifically with plants that are in the Ericaceae family. So those are rhododendron, orchid species, blueberries, cranberries, azaleas, which are rhododendrons. And basically similar to arbuscular mycorrhizae, where they actually produce hyphae inside the plant cell, they create these oils of a hyphae right inside. So it's similar to AM fungi, where it's super intimate interaction.
Thanks for clarifying that. Do you think that our forestry and plant pathology programs are providing a robust enough education on these mutualistic partnerships and how they help to build resiliency?
So I was in a plant pathology department at UF, which was really focused very heavily on agricultural plant pathology. UF is unique in that it does have a forestry pathology program, but I, at the time, did not take classes or wasn't really involved in that. And I can't speak too much to what the curriculum there looks like. But in terms of my curriculum at UF, we certainly had some classes. We touched on the kind of parasitism to mutualism spectrum in intro to plant pathology, but it was 1 or 2 slides. When I took the kind of mycology class, we might have had a week on mutualisms. But yeah, I think there isn't a lot of diving deep into how the mutualistic interactions lead to tree host resilience. One of the things that we'll probably get into later in the podcast, but thinking about the way that certain diseases like beech leaf disease right now, which is a carbohydrate depletion disease, that's going to have direct consequences on our microbial community. And so I'm really interested in how do not just pathogens, but other climate stressors, drought, flooding, these extreme climate events impact the microbial community? Are we losing functional diversity? And what impact does that have on the whole system? I don't know that's being addressed enough. And I hope that I can be a pioneer in that field, because I think sometimes it is hard to situate how do you bring in the mutualistic framework into a pathology lens. And so I appreciate that. I think you see the value in that.
Yeah, even in my lab, we've recently began to investigate the interactions between arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, vascular wilt pathogens, and plant health, and looking at how disease development is diminished, if not totally suppressed, in plants that are pre-inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. There's definitely some roles there.
And I think beyond that, like thinking about endophytes, right? Like endophytes are a big mutualistic interaction in plants. So what is the role of endophytes in tree host resilience? Or what is the interaction between pathogens and endophytes in certain canker forming diseases and stuff? So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions. And I think as our field becomes much more multidisciplinary, there's a lot of space to be working across boundaries and not always looking from the pathogenic framework, but looking at both.
Sounded to me like you were leaning a little bit towards Talipocladium discussion there, which makes sense given that Dr. Gazis was one of your co-advisors. But it actually brings up an important point in terms of fungal ecology. I was forthright in calling you a fungal ecologist, and I think we're starting to really appreciate the dual, if not 2+ roles that fungi play in these facultative lifestyles that we never knew about before. We think of Talipocladium or Ophiocordyceps relatives as insect pathogens, yet here they are as endophytes, probably serving some protection from insect attack in these plants that harbor these endophytic strains. But there's so much to uncover still.
Totally.
All right, so you moved to Florida after living in Northampton to do your PhD. You end up working on ectomycorrhizal fungi and Florida slash pines and the Florida pine rocklands, asking questions about restoration, and some of the same questions you were asking as an undergraduate with your undergraduate thesis. So really, my question here is, do you think that what you learned about ericoid mycorrhizal fungi made you uniquely prepared to jump into working on Suillus and tuber and rhizopogon?
Yes, I will just mention that after Smith College, I worked for a summer at Yale as a kind of summer technician. And then I went on for 2 years. I worked at Purdue University in Kathy Ames' lab, which is a systematics and phylogenetics fungal lab within a plant pathology department. And so I would say the writing might have been on the wall all along that I was going to ride this kind of mycology, plant pathology lifestyle, because I initially joined the AIM lab to work on a big project on ectomycorrhizal fungi that involved research in Cameroon and Guyana. That was what I initially went to the lab to study. And I was really excited because ericoid mycorrhizae are really interesting and really unique, but I was really interested in these big forest trees and ectomycorrhizae and trying to make that transition into a field that was just better known. And so I worked a little bit on that project, but then I ended up actually shifting to working a lot on coffee rust. There was a big project in the lab and the postdoc was only there for a year and then left. And so I was always focused on ectomycorrhizal fungi and then being pulled a little bit towards pathology. So I knew for my PhD that I really wanted to work on ectomycorrhizal fungi, and that was a big component in initially making contact with Matthew Smith, who is a mycologist and a prominent ectomycorrhizal researcher.
I saw that on your publication list that you had worked on coffee rust, and I was going to ask you about that. And I think those side paths we take sometime really help to expand our understanding of other systems. And I think there ends up being a lot of synergy and crosstalk. At the end of the day, rusts are obligate biotrophs, and mycorrhizal fungi are biotrophic too. You can learn information from studying coffee rust that you can then apply to a better, fuller understanding of mutualistic partnerships between fungi and plants.
Yeah. And I think, again, back to your question about just the need for kind of this mutualistic framework within tree host resilience. And I think I was always writing, my thesis work was a lot of looking at how things like climate change and habitat fragmentation were impacting these communities. But at the same time that I was working on that, I was working in Romina's diagnostic clinic, just looking all day at diseases and really getting interested in that. And so I think both things have always been present. And I think I was really fortunate to find a job that allowed me to blend both of those things.
I think as a forest pathologist, one thing that I could appreciate is that it's a lot harder to think about protecting perennial woody plants because of their long lifespan. I think about what happened a month ago in late September. Hurricane Helene came through, and it's one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes to hit the U.S. in 2 decades, right? It caused widespread destruction across the Southeast, and communities will take months, if not years, to recover. We're not covering the human aspect of this, but it's clear that there are people still struggling, and certainly we wish them the best as they move forward in that recovery process. But for me, as a forest pathologist and someone that thinks a lot about forests and ecosystems, I can't stop thinking about the tens of thousands of trees along the Blue Ridge Parkway and other forests that just got really hit. I saw some drone images of those forests, and how do those forests bounce back?
Yeah, exactly. Or just the fact that I'm thinking about Hurricane Sandy that was really detrimental in New England, where all of a sudden you have these communities of trees that have had a huge salt stress event where they probably wouldn't, and not necessarily the trees that are right along the beach, but trees that are inland but are not accustomed to hurricanes in New York State and New Jersey and Connecticut. And so I think we're seeing so many forests that are facing stressors that they've never seen before or that are very uncommon at a greater frequency. And I think that's concerning because it also forces researchers to break outside the box of what we've learned, thinking about, these are the areas that we should worry about fire here and we should worry about flooding here. It's at this point, anything, anywhere could be possible.
Yeah. And I see that you're working on the impact of salinity on mycorrhizal relationships. Maybe that's some of the work you're currently involved with at the Forest Service. Is that correct?
That was part of my dissertation work. I have gotten a little bit involved with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. They're really interested in reducing our salt impact. In New England, we have to desalt for our roads and our sidewalks before ice storms. And so they've been working a lot on trying to reduce salt in the environment, because once you have salt in the environment, it's really difficult to remediate out of wells and rivers and plant communities. So that's where my salt work has transitioned in helping to guide thoughts on how to reduce salt and what impact it has on plants.
here we are very close to Halloween. I came across a really cool page out of the Region 9 office in Wisconsin. And the title of the page was, "Are Zombie Trees or Ghost Trees Haunting Your Neighborhood?" And I thought, wow, this is a really appropriate topic, especially since the Forest Service themselves put out a page about it. And I thought this will give us a chance to pull together your work on mycorrhizal fungal communities in Florida, which is obviously also impacted by salinity, and on things that I'm sure you deal with a lot in a kind of fragmented landscape that's like urban tree and shrub health or shade tree pathology. Do you work a lot with communities that are dealing maybe with these ghost forests that are like transitioning to saltwater marshes essentially?
Yeah, so I often talk about ghost forests whenever I give talks on my dissertation research about salt in South Florida, because ghost forests are really an issue in Florida and along the Gulf Coast of these standing dead trees where you have saltwater inundation that's basically completely transitioned the forest to this salty marsh. And I'm curious if the article that you're talking about, is it in reference to ghost trees in the New England area, or are they referencing the ghost trees down south?
They're more talking about the contemporary threats that urban trees face, trees dying from the top down, woodpecker activity. So I think it's like a combination of probably emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, just a lot of the contemporary biotic threats that trees face. But it does bring in these larger things. What are the impacts that our forests, whether they be continuous forest and a national forest or hit by hurricanes or hurricane force winds or coastal red maple stands that are hit by saltwater intrusion and things like that? It circles back to this idea about assisted migration. And I think you're the perfect person to be there trying to help provide some solutions if solutions can be generated. The problem is that the storm surge we're seeing and the recurrence interval of these storms are happening at a rate where we can't really respond fast enough. How do you prioritize that, or how do you address that? Because I'm sure there's a lot of frustrated coastal landowners.
Yeah, I think now transitioning into kind of northeastern forests, a lot of predominantly deciduous forests that are facing a lot of combinations of abiotic stresses like drought. We had a drought several years ago that are still impacting our forests today. And then also the biotic component. So my unit within the Forest Service is the invasive species unit. And so all of us are working on invasive species problems. And so I think for a lot of folks within Connecticut, I'm shifting away from some of the coastal issues that I was dealing with in Florida as I've shifted my program. But I think a lot of people have this fear of what is happening to our forests. It's just the rate of the buildup of all these effects, right? So we've got drought in our forests, we've got spongy moth, we've got spotted lanternfly, we've got Asian longhorn beetle, we've got emerald ash borer, beech leaf disease, beech bark disease. I think we're at a really big turning point where as trees die or as major pests and pathogens come in, it's unclear what is going to be the next thing. So if we lose our beech in the forest, what's going to replace that beech? And how do the goods and services within those forests change? And I think we're at a big transition point where we're trying to manage multiple diseases at one time or multiple pests at one time, while also not really knowing what the next phase is going to be for a lot of these forests. And I think that can be challenging, because if you know how a forest is going to transition, you can start to manage for those new tree populations. You can start to think about the economics of that forest stand. But when you don't know necessarily what's going to come next, it does make it challenging.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about not only the historic diseases and historic pests that have been here, it's really the types of diseases that are impacting our landscape. For example, beech bark disease, you mentioned, that's one I worked on in Maine for my master's degree and one I'm intimately familiar with. And that's a canker disease, so it doesn't kill the root systems. And even though it kills a lot of beech trees, it's a paradox, and that leads to more beech in the forest in the form of these dog hair thickets of vegetative sprouts. But with beech leaf disease coming in, like you said, that's a carbohydrate depleter. It's going to take out all the excess resources from the roots. So you may not get another cohort of sprouts. Chestnut blight is similar to beech bark disease in that you still have a lot of chestnut around, but it's changed what the tree is and how it looks on the landscape. It reduced it to a understory shrub. Do you see beech leaf disease wiping out beech or knocking back beech enough that something like multiflora rose or barberry or some just other invasive plants coming in and just supplanting it?
Yeah, I think that's the concern of beech. Generally are these really large trees. They've got really large canopies, and so they provide a lot of shade in the forest, and that does help maintain a more open understory. But beech are also really good at resprouting, and like you mentioned, and beech leaf disease is a really interesting disease in how it, when it first came and when it started becoming a large problem. It's really been within the last 5 years in kind of the northeastern area that it's really taken off. And prior to now, we were not seeing mass mortality of beech. A lot of people were worried, are we going to lose our beech? Is this another tree that we're going to lose? And up until now, we are seeing not a ton of mass mortality. We're still not seeing mass mortality, but we are seeing more mortality as these trees have had the disease for longer. And I think that is a big concern of if we lose beech or if they start to resprout and stay in these really small kind of thickets in a forest, is that going to lead to more room for invasive plant species? And so that is a big question. And I know there are colleagues that are starting to work on doing plant surveys and asking those questions of, will the reduction of beech lead way for a lot of invasive plants to move in?
I think another unique thing about being someone who studies perennial woody plants, I think back to one of my mentors who was actually a research plant pathologist there, Dave Houston, and he was on my master's committee way back in the day, and he worked a lot on decline diseases. And for those of our listeners that aren't familiar with this concept, is that when there is a coincidental overlap, the stars aligning moment, for example, of enough predisposing, inciting, and contributing factors, trees can decline and die as a result of multiple causal agents in a certain progression. Whereas we often think about disease as, pathogen A came in on tree species B and killed it. I think what we're seeing in the face of climate change, at least in my area, in that is that there's a lot more predisposition because of the aberrant weather patterns. There's more inciting agents because there's more insect pests, exotic pests, and there's really unique opportunities for fungi that have always been present, are likely native, but they're acting opportunistically on our plants and plant communities.
Yeah. Actually, something I just thought of that kind of links back to the earlier question that you asked me about tree resilience is that in a forest setting, the way that we manage diseases is going to look really different than in an urban landscape or homeowners who are managing the few trees they have on their property. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is, okay, if you have certain treatments for certain pathogens, how are those treatments then going to have inadvertent consequences on the microbial community? And so one of those examples is beech leaf disease. They've just had an injection treatment. It's a fungicide that's been labeled to treat beech leaf disease. And I'm really curious, okay, if you inject a beech tree with a fungicide, what impact does that have on the microbial community? Maybe it's a drop in the bucket, or maybe it has a big impact. And so I think it's not just the disease that influences the microbial communities, but our treatments or our silvicultural tactics or any response to the pathogen. I'm interested in how those are at play too.
Excuse my ignorance on this because I don't study beech leaf disease. But I was under the impression that beech leaf disease was primarily a foliar nematode disease. And you said they're using a fungicide to control it? How does that work? And what am I missing?
Yes, I will say I'm not super understanding the mode of the pathway of how that fungicide works because, yeah, it's the same question. So I know there has been soil drenches that have been used to try to treat like the polyphosphate 30 soil drenches. There's been nematicides that have been used to treat it. But yes, beech leaf disease is a foliar nematode. There's been studies of whether there's bacterial or fungal interaction with the nematode. So far, there's nothing super concrete there. There may be some association. But yeah, the ArborJet injections that have been approved for injecting beech leaf disease are technically a fungicide.
Mm-hmm. We don't always understand how things work. Sometimes we have to test them over and over again to see the effect, and then we'll go back retrospectively and try to understand the mode of action. But clearly, these nematodes, even though they're plant pathogenic nematodes, there's all kinds of microbial partners in the plants and in the plant tissues. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I'm like, oh, am I that out of the loop that I just didn't know that they'd figured out a definitive fungal partner or something?
Yeah, no, there isn't a definitive fungal partner. And I certainly would love to follow up with you on that. But yeah, I can't speak to the specifics.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I think you made a good point about juxtaposing the forest management strategies with the frustrated landowner who has really old trees. If you take even something like a university campus, let's go back to your alma mater. I know that at Smith, Olmsted actually designed the botanic garden there. Frederick Law Olmsted, who actually did Central Park as well. There are some very beautiful cultivated locations in Connecticut and New England. I think similarly, when boxwood blight came through, there was just this frustration from estate owners and landowners and institutions that have these kind of nice cultivated landscapes. How do you deal with the frustrations of landowners that are seeing beech leaf disease ravage their copper beeches or something like that? Do you interact a lot with landowners in that regard?
The only experience that I've had is with some kind of local botanic gardens in Connecticut. And it's funny that you bring up copper beech, because I had someone specifically bring me a copper beech sample. It's definitely very symptomatic. It looked a lot better than our American beech. I was like, wow, this copper beech actually has leaves on it, which, to paint the picture of folks who are not familiar with beech leaf disease in Connecticut, some of the trees that we're looking at, you look at the canopy and I mean, without exaggeration, there's 200 leaves on a tree that is probably decades old. And so it's a really devastating disease. It causes bud abortion and leaf defoliation. And so on the copper beech, I'm looking at this tree. I'm like, wow, this is beautiful. There's leaves. It has, I think, more tolerance. We're not seeing as bad symptoms with the other beech species besides American beech. But I think it is tough when you have a disease, maybe not so much with beech leaf disease, but something like oak wilt, where if you have an infection where you really need to remove that tree to prevent spread, I think that's where you get that pushback, where it's really hard to have those conversations with folks. I know this tree is your prize tree. Maybe it's been in the family for hundreds of years. Maybe it's been at a university for decades. But in order to prevent further spread of this pathogen, this tree needs to be sacrificed. And I think those are difficult conversations. And I think as scientists and as plant pathologists, we have to do a lot of work preemptively before some of these pathogens show up on our landscape to set expectations and to try to make it we're responding communally to this pest and pathogen in the same way that quarantine, having to cut down trees because of Asian longhorn beetle or other pathogens. But it's tough. And I think you can compare it to a commercial grower who has an infection and you say, hey, you've got to treat your greenhouse, or you've got to completely eradicate this row of vegetables. Those are really hard conversations to have.
Certainly, those conversations are hard, but it's important that agencies like the Forest Service are reaching out to these communities.
Yeah, I think maintaining those partnerships ahead of time is really important to making sure that the trust is built, so that when you say, we've got to remove this tree or we've got to respond in this way, it doesn't feel like it's coming out of left field.
So what are you working on currently there? What would you say are the main invasive pathogens that you're working on?
Yeah, so I think I've touched on a few of them already. Beech leaf disease is really the big one, because that is the biggest pathogen in Connecticut right now. So beech leaf disease, and then also beech bark disease. A lot of my projects are related to the fact that beech bark disease is pretty uniformly on the landscape here. And then one of the other pathosystems that I'm really focused on is oak wilt. Connecticut has been fortunate that we do not have oak wilt yet in the state, but it's as close to us as New York State. And it's a pretty devastating pathogen of oaks that can cause pretty rapid decline of oaks. And so a lot of the work here is making sure that we're positioned well to respond to that, making sure the partnerships across agencies, a lot of the work I'm doing on that pathosystem is related to that. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of beech leaf disease, I've got a project with another pathologist in the Northern Research Station who does a lot of spectral near infrared spectroscopy and building models for early disease detection. And because Connecticut has both beech leaf disease and beech bark disease, which is not always true in other states, we're starting to look at models that were built just for beech leaf disease and bring them into new areas where there's co-occurring diseases to see if the model holds up. Are there different spectral profiles when you have multiple co-occurring diseases?
Because we've had changes in weather patterns, particularly in the central Appalachian region, we've seen a lot more precipitation in the form of rain in the winter, and we don't really have snow stay on the ground. What this means is that we have a lot of saturated soils that are not frozen, so there's a lot more microbial activity during the dormant season when plants have no ability to respond. As such, we've seen a real spike in root rots. Rhododendron, come back to something that you worked on early on. I've seen whole stands of rhododendron go down, seemingly from root rot, and it's along these wet hemlock ravines where the soils are wet and they don't freeze anymore. And I know it's more complicated than that, but certainly Phytophthora cinnamomii is a big player in trying to restore chestnut to the landscape. It's a real problem in the nurseries and real problem in the forest. Are you seeing that with beech?
We are not so far. We're lucky that Connecticut really doesn't have a big Phytophthora problem across the landscape, but that is something that we're worried about and trying to keep it out of the landscape, because once you have Phytophthora, it's really hard to manage and eradicate it. But yeah, the thing that you had mentioned too about having these really saturated soils, it'll be interesting because even our mutualistic fungi exists on this spectrum. And so I think there's been a lot more attention in the media, I think, because I've had the general public ask me a lot about, are these mycorrhizal associations going to turn parasitic? And I think these are interesting questions. These are mutualisms that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. So they're really important mutualisms. But we're now kind of facing a whole new landscape in terms of less snowpack. And so it is going to be interesting. I don't think all the mycorrhizal fungi are going to become parasitic, but it is interesting to look at how specific species or specific genera of fungi may respond to these changing climates.
Yeah. If you think about a situation where your soil is completely saturated and you have to basically change your lifestyle in order to survive, some may, just by random chance, and may deviate from their close relatives.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people studying oak-dominated forests, I've had a pulse on what's happening with oak in recent decades. And one of the things, obviously, I've noticed is that we've seen an uptick in sudden white oak mortality, like they saw in Missouri a decade back and parts of Maryland and West Virginia. We're seeing a lot more diplodia, which is a fungal canker, and it also occurs in New England. It's been documented there on several red and white oak species. But this, again, comes back to this decline disease. Like you get a Phytophthora root rot feeding on the roots because the soils are wet. And then you have an opportunistic diplodia fungus that comes in and causes bleeding cankers and drought and defoliating caterpillars like spongy moth, coming in. So there's all these things tipping the scales in favor of disequilibrium across many of our forested landscapes. And it's a little disheartening to see.
Yeah, it's a fun time to be a plant pathologist right now. I guess job security, right? But,
right.
And I think sometimes it's hard to not to spiral in, oh my God, what is happening to our forests? I think especially when you talk to the public and they're like, there's another pest we have to worry about. There's another pathogen. And just trying to keep in perspective that there's always been pests and pathogens, and some start off as a big problem and then end up really not being super problematic in the long run, and some are really devastating, and yet we've adapted and bounced back and new things have come in and replaced it. So yeah, you have to take it one day at a time. But it is interesting. I think a lot is changing, like you mentioned, where you have a lot of trees where you've got multiple diseases going on at one time. And I think sometimes it can be challenging to know What is the predominant thing that's going on here? Do we have to think about both diseases at the same time and be trying to manage for both? Or is really one the predominant thing and the other one is an opportunistic pathogen that's hopped on while this tree is stressed?
There's a lot to think about. We've had USDA folks on here, but we haven't had, at least during my time as host, a USDA Forest Service researcher on. What is that career path? How does it differ from the assistant professor, research pathologist who teaches obviously the teaching component, but what's unique about your position that you like, and what are some things that maybe you miss from academia that you wish you could integrate into your position?
Yeah, so I think the major difference Forest Service employees, and this is true also with ARS, they're 100% research appointments. And so that means all of our time is dedicated to research. Similar to USDA ARS, I think a lot of scientists within the federal government have the option to add things as they like. So if you want to teach, there are scientists who have adjunct faculty positions at local universities, and they may teach a course or co-teach a course. I'm relatively new in my position, but many scientists co-advise or serve on university committees. And so that component of the job is really similar, but the day-to-day is 100% research. We're not filling our time with as much, I think, committee involvement and administrative involvement in teaching duties that professors have. So I think that's the main difference. And that was what really attracted me to this position, is the idea that if I want to teach, I can add that. But if I don't want to teach, I don't have to. And that's been a really nice component.
Yeah. I've had two of my former PhD students go on to work for the Forest Service. There's a lot of benefit to working for the federal government. I appreciate what your agency does. When I got into forestry and went to forestry school, I had dreamed of working at the Forest Service and just was compelled towards academia, but I have the utmost respect for the work that the Forest Service does. And I know, like a lot of other federal agencies, don't necessarily get the tip of the hat and the thank you that they deserve a lot, even though they're doing a lot of good work, like fungi hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm in research and development within the Forest Service. So the Forest Service has three main branches. Research and development is one of the smallest branches, and it's gotten smaller. Our agency, used to have thousands of scientists, and now that's, I think, just under 900. So we have national forests, we have state and private, which are scientists who are working with landowners that have land that's not federally owned, so state and private land, and how to manage those landscapes with the different strategic priorities. Yeah. And then there's research and development. We're a very large agency, but the component that I'm in is actually really the smallest component of the agency.
So I'm an undergrad. I'm interested in maybe working for the Forest Service. You have a program.
We have a Pathways program, which I think starts at the college level. Enroll to be a Pathways student. And the idea is that kind of sets you up for a potential career in the Forest Service by, you generally start working with a mentor. Some of those folks go on to be technicians. And then I know some folks within that program, some of them have gone back to school, like to get their master's or their PhD and then come back. So I think you see these Pathways students, some of the people have worked 40 years in the Forest Service, really long service. And I think a lot of those folks come in quite young, either in high school or college.
Well, you have that program here. We have an office here in Morgantown for the Forest Service. And because of that close proximity, we have that program where there's advertisement from some of our botanists or our forest pathologist or an entomologist. They have those adjunct positions that you talked about earlier, and they fit in seamlessly with our faculty to help support research and research projects on the Mon National Forest and other really important federal lands in the Central Appalachian region.
Yeah, so some of the Forest Service offices are located really close or right on a university campus. So I know the Morgantown office is really closely aligned with the university. And I would say, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but a component of the Forest Service is located really in close proximity with the university, and then others aren't. So our office is a little bit standalone. We're close to Yale, but we're about an hour from UConn, and we don't have that kind of direct relationship. And that's one of the things that being in this role, I think there's really a need to have better relationships with universities, and that can be challenging when you're not located right on campus. But I'm hopeful that I just became gratis faculty at UConn, and so I'm hoping that will start to forge some of those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one of the most well-known national forests, the Mon National Forest here, and it's just such a treasure. But it's in part due to the great management work of the U.S. Forest Service, where we're happy to partner with them on bigger ecosystem questions and forest health questions.
The Forest Service is really unique in that we aren't just preserving land specifically for the beauty. The Forest Service is thinking about managing land in a way that's either sustainable or thinking about the other kind of goods and services on the landscape. And that's particularly why people go to the National Forest for all sorts of recreational purposes, really trying to manage forests to be sustainable and provide all those goods and services.
And I think it's an important distinction between national parks and national forests is the ability or the inability to actively manage, especially in things like the aftermath of a hurricane. Hurricane Helene knocked down the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of trees. And I think the ways forward for the Park Service versus the Forest Service, which are different agencies, are very different. But I think that a conservation-based approach where there's still resource management and things like silviculture and timber harvesting is a good thing, because by optimizing spacing and density of trees, you're going to increase vigor to help build resilient forests.
And help with the pests and pathogens. I mean, having all your trees all together.
Yeah, that's right. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
We've just heard from Dr. Elena Karlsen-Ayala, research plant pathologist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station in Hamden, Connecticut. We provided some relevant links in the show notes section immediately following the episode description, so be sure to check those out. I'm Matt Kasson, host of Plantopia. Thanks for listening.